I'm Kara Holsapple. You probably heard by now that, according to a new UN report, the world has just over a decade to get climate change under control before it's too late. And the report says we need a profound transformation to get there. So, what does President Trump say about this?
It was given to me. And I want to look at who drew it, which group drew it, because I can give you reports that are fabulous and I can give you reports that aren't so good. But I will be looking at it, absolutely.
The report has got us thinking about an episode we aired last year about what life on Earth could look like with the worst-case scenario. Here it is again.
This is the Trump on Earth podcast. I'm Reed Frazier.
Well, the Pope believes in global warming. You do know that, right? Hey, in this room, it's so hot in here, maybe I'll start to believe it myself. This room is hot.
This is insanity, and this is just the latest. Hawking's been saying if we don't colonize an asteroid, if we don't colonize Mars or the moon or something, we're all dead, and we've got to do it, within the next generation, or we're cooked.
If you Google the phrase "that New York Magazine article," the first thing that'll come up is an article written this summer entitled "The Uninhabitable Earth." As the title suggests, it's a portrait of a worst-case scenario of climate change in which the planet gets so hot, humans and many other organisms can no longer live there. The crop-producing regions of the world turn into dust bowls, the air becomes too hazardous to breathe, and ancient diseases are unleashed from melting tundra. It was the most widely read article in the online history of New York Magazine. Its imagined future so grim it spawned response articles like, "Are we as doomed as that New York Magazine article says?" Here to talk about this article and what we journalists should be saying about climate change is the author, David Wallace-Wells. And I should say we're recording this at the Society of Environmental Journalists annual conference in Pittsburgh. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
So let's just get to it. Just walk me through, why did you want to write this article?
Well, I tended to feel like there was a real narrowness to how that story was being told. And by that I mean basically two big things. The first is that people seemed really focused on what most scientists would call a kind of median outcome scenario, probably about 2 or 2.5 degrees of warming. And the second part, that they were focused almost exclusively on sea level rise. And the more that I read about the new science, the more both of those seemed really problematic to me. A median outcome means that fully half of the possible outcomes are on the far end of that spectrum, so worse than, say, 2.5 degrees. And I didn't think that most lay readers really understood how grim that would be, and really even what it would look like if we did get to, say, 3 or 4 degrees warming. And the second part is, they really didn't understand things like the effect on agriculture, the effect on conflict. Anecdotally, I felt it was really easy for many of us to think of climate change as something that was happening elsewhere to other people. And even if we understood that, say, the flooding of Bangladesh would produce tens of millions or maybe hundreds of millions of climate refugees, we could still sort of compartmentalize it in our minds. And understanding that, for instance, extreme weather would strike anywhere across the U.S., it's not just hurricanes, it's also tornadoes and droughts, and also that agricultural production would be limited and that economic growth could be cut by as much as 1% for every degree of warming. These were all things that would affect everybody on the planet. And I thought it was really important that the public understand that climate change would touch their lives, no matter where they lived, no matter who they were, no matter how wealthy they were. That's all a kind of advocate's answer, which is part of what motivated me. But also, just as a journalist, as a storyteller, I felt like we had not really reckoned with or looked straight at some of the more dramatic, horrifying possibilities, and I thought it was important to sort of share that news from science with our readers.
I guess we should sort of step back and say what some of those impacts are that your research envisions. I'll just read a couple of the subtitles. The end of food, permanent economic collapse, poisoned oceans. I guess you get the point. There's a lot of bad stuff that could happen. kind of outline just two or three?
Sure. Well, before I want to talk about the particulars, let me just say, this article did survey worst case scenarios, and I did say explicitly in the piece that I think we're not likely to get to many of these places because as we proceed along our trek, we'll get more and more alarmed about climate change and we'll take action that will forestall them. But if we don't, some of these impacts can be really, really terrifying. So at the end of food is about agriculture, various estimates, but some of the best ones are that for every degree of warming, there's a between 10 and 15% loss in grain yields, and grain is the main source of food for the world. So theoretically, by the year 2100, if we have a 5-degree warmer world, we could have about half as bountiful a grain yield, and all of the population projections are for a world that has about 50% more people than we have now. So we're dealing with 50% more people and 50% less food to give them. That's really scary. The stuff that was probably most alarming, most scary to people was the effect of direct heat. So there's a temperature beyond which humans just can't live. You need to give off heat in order to survive. So in certain parts of the world, it will be possible if the planet is 4 or 5, 6 degrees warmer, that for long stretches of the year, it will not be possible to go outside without suffering heat stroke and, in a lot of cases, death. There are a few places in the world where that's kind of already the case, but likely if we get a few degrees warmer, it'll become much, much more of a problem. The stuff that was actually most interesting to me, most exciting to me, was this sort of new research on economic effects and conflict. And this is some of the research that is sort of least conventional wisdom now. It's the most cutting edge stuff that I included in the article, but there is a lot of evidence that conflict is really closely correlated with heat. That is true at an individual level, at a kind of city level. You see crime waves are always in the summer. It's true, there's some funny research about how retaliation in baseball games happens more in the summer than in the spring or in the fall. But it also happens at the much bigger level, at the social level, at the state level. And the people who are doing the best work on this estimate that for every half degree of warming, you could see between 10 and 20% more global conflict. So again, if we're talking about a 5-degree warmer world, which is where the UN thinks we will end up if we do absolutely nothing to stop climate emissions.
5 degrees Celsius or centigrade, not Fahrenheit. In Fahrenheit terms, that's like what, 9 degrees?
Yeah, I don't know, 8.5, 9 degrees. That means that by the year 2100, that we could have twice as much war as we have today. Those are correlations. We don't really understand whether they're causations or how the causal arrows move and what causes what, but it's terrifying. We don't live in a very peaceful world at the moment, and to think that conflict could double would be really bad. And then you think about all of the social unrest that conflict unleashes, and it just multiplies the effect. For me personally, one of the things that really woke me up to this bigger way of thinking about climate change was watching the Syrian refugee crisis unfold. And, we know that civil war it doesn't have a single cause of climate change, but climate change did play a significant role in the crop failures that preceded the civil war because of drought. That conflict has produced several million refugees. And those several million refugees have meaningfully, I would say, scrambled at least European politics and in a lot of ways global geopolitics. That's 2 or 3 million refugees. And the flooding of Bangladesh, which is already baked in, this isn't even projecting out future warming, just given the warming that we know we're going to get, is going to produce at least 10 times that many.
So there was an Atlantic Magazine article and lots of response articles. Are we as doomed as that New York Magazine article says, in which Katherine Hayhoe and Michael Mann, two prominent climate scientists who are often called upon by people like me and you to sort of help us understand the enormity of climate change, and they pushed back on your article. They said basically a lot of the assertions were unsupported by the evidence. They weren't, ready to go as far as you took it, and that essentially climate change is bad enough. We don't need to exaggerate. I just want to get your response to that criticism.
I think that's a slight mischaracterization. I think that a few scientists took some issue with a couple of factual points, but shortly after we published it, in response to that, we published a fully annotated version of the piece, which showed basically where everything came from. And I think basically that sort of answered the questions about the particular science. The bigger question about framing and what lesson to take from some of these findings is an open one, and many scientists, it's true, felt that my story was sort of a bit too alarmist, and that it, especially in the way it was framed as telling the story about how we could possibly get to an uninhabitable Earth, was a little far-fetched. And on that point, I mean, I don't think we're going to get that far. I said that in the article. I think in part because of human ingenuity, and in part because when we start to see what happens from climate change, we'll take action more urgently than we have already. But on the question of how to talk about the scary, unlikely, but possible outcomes, I just have a different perspective than they do. I understand that activists do experience burnout. They are susceptible to losing hope. And I think, a lot of times they think as a result that the public also needs as much hope as they need fear. I say this as someone who sort of came to climate journalism, and to the extent that I'm involved in climate advocacy late, I just don't think that that's true as a characterization of the public.
So this is funny because I work for an environmental news show, and we're always at the end of every episode, we're like, do we need something uplifting? And it's always a debate we have, well, do we? I mean, but we just talked about a toxic waste dump and air pollution and premature, birth effects from some sort of toxic, emissions. And we're always looking for somebody who's starting their own organic garden and some sort of good news story. Anybody who is part of this profession who's dealing with this seemingly inexorable, insurmountable problem has come up against is this question of, do we need to scare people? If we scare people too much, they're just going to be like, dude, that's it. It's, it's like that scene in Aliens where the guy says, game over, dude. It's over. Let's just quit. Or do people really need to just be frightened to action?
I have basically two responses to that question. And one is to say that it's really strange within the world of journalism, the way that people writing about climate feel obligated to also act as advocates and to consider their impacts on their readers, listeners. I don't think it's bad, but it is unusual. I actually wasn't thinking much about exactly the best way to motivate readers to take action. I was really thinking the scientists have been writing for a few years about much more alarming possibilities than the journalists have been covering in their outlets. That's a story that deserves to be told. The public should know about it. They should wrestle with it, think about it. But I have to say that even if I think just in terms of advocacy terms and how to best motivate people, I feel that among non-activists, that complacency is a much bigger problem than fear, that people need to understand the stakes of what is going on, what it means to be, for us not to take meaningful action or to delay meaningful action. Most of the best understanding we have is that most Americans care about climate change. They worry about global warming, but it's not at the top of their political priority list. I just don't think that that's a portrait of a population that is near some tipping point for despair. It seems to me much more likely that those people need to be a little bit more alarmed so that they can make climate change a first-order political priority. We went through a presidential election. Neither of the candidates were asked about climate in any of the debates. Obviously, it was something that Hillary was concerned about, but it wasn't like it was the crusade of her campaign or any one of the top crusades of her campaign. And I think that a public that is more alarmed will make that kind of focus more likely. And I think that that's the most important thing that any of us can do, actually, about climate. I think many people tend to think about this issue in terms of what they can do in their own lives, and that's important. But I think that the effects are really trivial compared to the effects of political action. And I think the main thing that's going to make political action more likely is people to be more alarmed about what's happening.
I think there's and you touched on this in the article, there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to oh, well, we'll just figure out the technology and we'll fix it. Can you just talk about that, I guess? Why do we always think that improving technology will fix things in the future?
Well, I think part of it is that it makes it easier on us. We don't have to cut back ourselves. We don't have to make costly decisions ourselves. And part of it is that we've lived through a really remarkable century or century and a half of technological change. I think we're learning now that a lot of that change was as damaging as it was creative, but still the experience of someone looking back at the way the world was 100 years ago or 150 years ago, comparing it to the way the world is now, you think, well, humans have managed to do some pretty extraordinary things. And if this is really an existential threat, then presumably we'll figure out how to deal with it in some way. And I think that there's some hope for that. I don't think that's totally diluted. But I also think that there are real shortcomings to technological optimism about this issue. I mean, we hear a lot about the price of green energy coming down, and the truth is it is coming down, and that's great. It's coming down a lot faster than most people predicted, but green energy actually hasn't meaningfully grown as a share of our energy consumption globally over the last 50 years. And I think going forward, it will probably have some impact, but there are also limits to that. Can't have wind power everywhere because there's not wind everywhere. You can't have water power everywhere because we've already basically dammed up all the water sources of water power that we could possibly dam up, so there's not much to go there. Solar power is, of those three, there's also nuclear, which is a whole separate issue, but solar power is, of those three, probably the most scalable. But there are also major issues with even the energy grids of really well-developed countries, and issues with how complicated it is to transport energy over long distances. It's one of the reasons why Tesla is so important. It's not just that they're inventing electric cars that will work. It's possible also that their battery technology will really change the way that we're allowed to move energy generally, and that could, in the end, be more important than the electric cars because it could enable a real solar-powered future. But there are all of these reasons to be skeptical that we could go completely green at any kind of medium-term timescale. And if we don't go totally green, say over the next 30, 35 years, cost to the planet will be really dramatic. I mean, we talked a little bit before about, the say 2.5, 3 degree threshold. That really is really bad. Like if we get there, a lot of the things that I talk about in the article will begin to happen. They won't happen as dramatically as I sketched out, but there almost certainly will be more conflict. There will be failed states as a result. There will be famine. There will be, heat waves in many places across the world where people die quite regularly in quite large numbers. A lot of the weather patterns of the world will be scrambled as a result. And we just have not started to plan for those eventualities. So even if parts of the world will be relatively stable, the disruption to the global social economic infrastructure will be significant in a way that will affect absolutely everybody. And that's really scary. And that's just if we get to the best case scenario.
I'm just curious hearing you talk about this. Like, did writing this affect you in any way? I mean, did it get you super bummed out or did it, I don't know, wake you up and all of a sudden you're like biking to work or like, how does this affect you personally to write about it? Something like this?
I think it just is a sign of my particular cast of mind that I found it not especially depressing to write. I found it sort of exciting to write. This goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, which is that I really do come from a journalistic background, and I felt researching and reporting, like the excitement of uncovering a big story that had not yet been told. It was also the case that I came to the research from a relatively dark place about climate. I had been sort of following it as an amateur, but quite closely, and seeing more and more alarming news. And in particular, there was this week of unusually warm weather in the Arctic right after the presidential election when I was feeling apocalyptic for some other reasons. And I knew enough about runaway climate change to think, like, wow, could the whole environmental system change really rapidly? Could this week of 67 degree warmer than normal temperature signal something really dramatic? And in my reporting, I basically learned that no, that wasn't the case. We're still on a relatively gradual course. But I heard from a lot of people reading the article who felt really depressed by it. A number of people I know, but also a number of people who wrote about the piece, called into radio shows about it, were talking about how it changed their thinking about having children and the future of, the next generation. And I don't feel that way. I'm still excited to have kids and bring them into this world and hopefully figure out how to make it a decent world for them to live in. And I think in general, there are a lot of things that are going to get a lot worse with climate, but we're not going to get to a place where we should feel uncomfortable bringing kids into the world. And in part, that's because I believe in technological ingenuity, and I believe in our capacity to be woken up, and I believe in our political systems to take action against particular entrenched interests. So I have hope for all those reasons. On the other hand, I think it's notable that, for all of human history, if you look back at the long span of human history, we've never had anything like global government. We've never had anything like a real framework for true global cooperation on anything until the last century, the middle of the last century. And now we're at a place because of climate where we really need that for the first time. And we see in a lot of parts of the world, people turning away from that kind of cooperation, turning away from those institutions. And that's scary. So, it's bleak out there. I also think there's no reason yet to give up hope.
That was David Wallace-Wells. We talked about his article, The Uninhabitable Earth, which appeared in New York Magazine this summer. We'll link to it on our website, trumponearth.org. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. My name is Reed Frazier. If you like the show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. That's Patreon with an E. Also, feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. That helps too. This is a production of the Allegheny Front, a public radio show covering the environment in Pennsylvania. For more, go to AlleghenyFront.org. And Point Park University's Environmental Journalism program. More at pointpark.edu. Thanks to grad student Rebecca Lessner. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. I'm Reed Frazier. I'll see you next time.